This week, the sounds of missiles and bombardments did not cease on the war fronts in Ukraine. The address of the most violent conflicts is still referred to as Donetsk Oblast. In this period when the tension in the war increased with the incredible attacks organized by the Kiev army, the Moscow army had to reduce its attacks. While Putin's soldiers, struggling with serious problems in terms of ammunition reserves, rebelled against the Moscow regime, the Ukrainian forces are taking advantage of this situation very well before the new year. Because of ammunition problems, Russia had to reduce its offensive operations. British intelligence also claimed that the Moscow army's troops, especially in Donetsk, are currently experiencing a very serious shortage of supplies and ammunition. But Russian leader Vladimir Putin tried to hide that his army was in a weak position in Donetsk, especially in the city of Bakhmut. No matter how hard Russia tries to hide it now, Ukrainian armed forces troops in Bakhmut are gradually pulling the invading Russian soldiers from their trenches and military command centers. All the attention of the media focused on this region. There is no way Putin can hide the situation any longer. On behalf of the Kiev army, the fighting of the Battle of Bakhmut has now moved near a church on the southern side of the region, as positive news continues to come from Ukraine's eastern fronts. But this area is located far from Ukraine's strongest fortifications in Bakhmut. In other words, the Moscow army wants to seize the city from the south of Bakhmut, but Putin's troops have not yet reached the strongest Ukrainian defense line in this region. It seems unlikely that Russia will reach these solid Ukrainian fortifications on the south side of Bakhmut in the future, because the Ukrainian armed forces has now started to use its elite troops to protect the southern line of Bakhmut. You may remember that last week, the Azov Special Elite troops of the Ukrainian armed forces entered the city of Bakhmut just to protect these defense lines from Russian invaders. Strengthening the defense lines for a week, this legendary Ukrainian special unit acted as a game-changer in Bakhmut. Russia, on the other hand, put forward the Wagner Group troops and, most importantly, Kadyrov's forces to change the course on the front. Especially recently, Wagner troops and Chechen Kadyrov soldiers, who are much more effective than the Russian army in Donetsk Oblast, cannot resist the Ukrainian forces on this front line. The Russian army is exhausted, struggling to fight and inflicting heavy losses. Despite this, Kadyrov claimed earlier in the week that he inflicted heavy losses on the Ukrainian army. However, Kadyrov's situation was moving in the opposite direction of what Kadyrov had claimed. The Ukrainian armed forces blew up a large military base of Kadyrov in Zaporizhia this week, inflicting heavy losses. In addition, thousands of Kadyrov's troops were destroyed by the Ukrainian army in Donbass. I want to draw our attention here. The eastern front of Ukraine is defended with the contributions of Ukraine's most special brigades, and, most importantly, the International Legion. The International Legion includes hundreds of Russians, Belarusians, and thousands of Chechen elite fighters. That's why this front is so important. And here, Chechen elite fighters and Azov Regiment elite fighters are the groups with the highest combat experience. Although these special groups are originally from Chechen or Russian origin, they rebelled against the Russian regime, against living under nonsense and tyranny, like Putin's dreamed absurd Russian Union. The Ukrainian armed forces are fighting against 3 different war fronts in Donetsk, in Bakhmut, that is, in the Donbass in general. On the one hand, the Russian army, on the other, Kadyrov soldiers and members of the Wagner Group. But so far, as we mentioned, the Ukrainian army has accomplished much more than expected. In particular, Kadyrov's troops are now beginning to melt away during the Battle of Bakhmut. The Moscow administration used the Chechen leader's soldiers as pawns in the conflicts in Bakhmut. Although not reflected in the media, thousands of Kadyrov and Wagner mercenaries were destroyed in the city of Bakhmut by Ukraine's elite Chechen battalions and Azov battalions. Even Kadyrov did not expect this, and for this reason, he has not been able to make an Armageddon statement lately or even appear in front of the media. The Moscow administration does not pay much attention to the losses both in the Wagner Group and among Kadyrov's troops, as the number of troop losses in the Russian armed forces is approaching 103,000. But Vladimir Putin's reckless attitude causes the troops of Kadyrov and Wagner to fight reluctantly in the Ukrainian war. Currently, Kadyrov's soldiers, who have suffered thousands of casualties in the Battle of Bakhmut, are forcibly held on these fronts of Ukraine. Chechen leader Ramazan Kadyrov, known as Putin's adopted son, also keeps his army soldiers on these fronts by threatening them with death. Low morale and sense of obligation combined with the fear of death, both Kadyrov's soldiers and the Wagner Group's mercenaries do not have much luck in the face of the determined resistance and attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces. The governor of Luhansk, Serhiy Haidai, also made striking statements about this situation. Serhiy Haidai stated that the Russian invaders, Kadyrov's forces, and Wagner's mercenary army lost thousands of soldiers in operations near the city of Bakhmut. According to Haidai, when it comes to Bakhmut, despite all these negatives, the city is no longer even a strategic military plan, but a symbolic issue loved by the Kremlin regime. After these massive losses in Bakhmut, Chechen forces and Wagner troops led by the puppet leader Ramazan Kadyrov, and fighting as part of the Russian army, want to prove themselves and show that they can now achieve something. But the current situation does not allow the Chechens and Wagner troops, who suffered so many casualties, to launch a new offensive in Bakhmut, the most active front in the Donetsk Oblast. After all these striking details, Ukrainian leader Zelensky appeared before the media after the events in Donbass. Vladimir Zelensky stated that hot clashes continue in the Donbass region, where the war against Russia continues. Zelensky made shocking assessments about the war between Russia and Ukraine in a video message he published on his social media account at night. Zelensky said that hot clashes continue in the settlements located in the Donetsk and Luhansk sides in the Donbass region of his country, and said, "The situation there is difficult and painful, but the soldiers of our army continue their struggle against the invading Russian army with everything they have." In addition, Zelensky stated that the Moscow army could not advance in these regions despite these intense attacks, and thanks the soldiers of the Ukrainian armed forces for their struggle against the Russian forces. Zelensky stated that power cuts continue throughout the country and nearly 9 million people are left without electricity because the energy infrastructures to which the Russian forces attacked were damaged, adding that the repair work of the energy facilities continues. Noting that the Russian army is likely to launch missile attacks against his country in the coming days, the Ukrainian leader said, "Air defense systems are being prepared, the state is being prepared, and everyone should be prepared. Please pay attention to the sirens." Regarding the latest situation in the war, Russian leader Vladimir Putin, interestingly, for the first time, started to emphasize peace negotiations so much for the first time due to the very bad situation of his army in Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin, in his statement on the possibility of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, stated that they are ready to negotiate with the parties on acceptable issues. These shocking statements made a lot of noise in the Moscow administration. Or did the Russian leader realize that he had nowhere to run anymore? The massive losses of the Moscow army had a great influence on Vladimir Putin's following such a stance. In addition, the unexpected striking advances of the Ukrainian army on the Donetsk fronts forced Putin to take a step back. However, while the local people in Russia are already experiencing anger at the Moscow regime against the bad course, Putin's risky approach to peace negotiations may cause some balances in Russia to change. Especially in the Kremlin, cold winds were blowing towards the Russian leader at the beginning of December. With this unsuccessful performance of the Moscow army on the territory of Ukraine, the intensity of the wind blowing against the Russian leader in the Kremlin increased considerably. The Moscow administration, which now has difficulties in restraining Russian citizens, wants its leaders to be much more careful and sensitive about the Ukraine war, because if the revolts against the Moscow regime in Russia flare up much more, Putin will have opened a new war front not only in Ukraine, but also in his own country. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications in order to be informed about new videos. Thank you for watching us.